Howdy folks, this is Big Sam, and by the end of this video, you might learn something interesting about your Mosin Nagant that you didn't know before. Today, we're taking another look at these magazines with this early pattern sling swivel. Now, a lot of you may not realize this, but for the first 20 years that the Mosin Nagant was produced, every magazine for the M91 three-line infantry rifle, which is the standard issued infantry rifle of Imperial Russia, had a sling swivel attached to the magazine. This was the standard pattern. Now the Dragoons and the Cossacks, as well as the 1907 carbine, didn't have this. It was just for the M91 rifle. You see, those patterns of rifles actually had provisions for sliding your sling through the stock. They actually had a hole through the stock. Just like every single, 9130 rifle or M44 rifle does today. But the original M91 rifle didn't have those holes in the stock. There were no holes in the stock, in fact. It just had the sling swivel here, and there was another sling swivel attached to the bottom of the front barrel band. Now, after the Russo-Japanese War, Imperial Russia found out that, well, their M91 rifle had quite a lot of problems. This was just one of them. If you look here, it's actually attached by a screw. So it's actually really easy for, you could imagine if marching around, Siberia or Eurasia or, some really cold place, a whole bunch, this is going to work out, and eventually what's going to happen is your rifle is strung across your back. This is going to come out and, your rifle is going to fall off behind you. Not a good scenario. Now, to combat this, on some patterns I've seen, and this example has this, you see they kind of staked it here, these two little marks, where they actually tried to stake it and kind of press it in so the screw doesn't work itself out. And it appears to have sort of worked. It's still here, so that's cool. But the arsenals, the Russian arsenals, this was not standard practice to do. This little staking here. So someone else did this. I've seen this. This is relatively common, but a lot of them don't have this. I would say, I don't know, somewhere between 20 to 40% of the magazines I see with sling swivels will have these little stakes here. An interesting little tidbit. That's just been my experience. Now, after around 1910, they just removed these entirely, and then they kind of wised up and said, well, we'll just go and put the holes in the stock like we're already doing for our Dragoon and Cossack models and the 1907 carbine as well. So they at least standardized on that. That was a good thing. That's a good improvement. So after around 1910-ish, we would start to see newly produced M91 rifles without this sling swivel. Instead, we would see, just like we're used to today, we just have this little rivet here. Okay. Now, some of this we've gone over before, and hopefully you aren't bored yet. We're going to get into something a little bit interesting, though, because today I'm actually focusing on magazines that used to have this sling swivel, but don't anymore. Right? So there's really three patterns of magazines we're looking at here today. The first pattern is a magazine that was produced with a sling swivel, and it has a sling swivel today. The second pattern is a magazine that used to have a sling swivel originally, but no longer does. And then the third pattern is a magazine that just never had a sling swivel to begin with. So you might ask, well, Big Sam, how do we know that it used to have a sling swivel? That's a good question. Now, one thing we can look at to check is the actual manufacturer mark of the magazine. We can see, all right, who produced this magazine? The mark is important because it'll tell us, A, who produced it and roughly when it was produced. So if we look at this magazine here, the producer's mark should always be here on the bottom of the magazine, right here. If we look on this guy, we can see a triangle with this arrow in it, right here. This means this magazine was produced by the Izhevsk factory after 1928. That's when they started to use this mark here. So what we can know here is that automatically we know that this magazine never had a sling swivel, because they stopped producing magazines with sling swivels around 1910, give or take. This one was made after 1928, so we already know this never had one. But this can get a little more complicated. If we look at this guy, now ignore for a minute that this has a sling swivel. We're just looking at this manufacturer mark here. This is actually a little hammer, okay? And this mark means that this magazine was produced by the Tula arsenal in Russia before 1928. So somewhere between 1891 and 1928, this magazine was produced. So right off the bat, that doesn't tell us for sure that this magazine was produced with a sling swivel, but we know it could have been, right? So we know a magazine had to have been made before 1928 in order to have had a sling swivel originally. Now there's only one manufacturer of the Mosin Nagant where if you see that it was manufactured by them, you automatically know that it had a sling swivel. And that would be the Châtellerault arsenal in France. You see, France actually made the first Mosin Nagants. And they produced Mosin Nagants from around 1892 all the way to 1895. And they would only produce the M91 three-line rifle pattern. They would not produce any other pattern of Mosin Nagant. Now, if we look here, the manufacturer mark, they use several different ones, but one you'll see here is a C in a circle. Whenever you see that, that generally means Châtellerault. We can also see here this interesting shield marking. Now, a shield marking like this is cool because that similar marking you will also see on other French rifles, such as the Berthier. And again, we know that because this magazine was produced by the Châtellerault arsenal, that it absolutely had a magazine. So that's cool. But what do we do with the cases where we have a magazine that we know it was made before 1928, but we say maybe it was made by Tula or Izhevsk? Well, there's actually an interesting way to tell here. Let's take a look at this rivet here. See around this rivet? We can actually see this little recess here. It's actually a wear spot. And if I rub my finger over it right here, I can actually feel where there's this worn spot right in here. And you can kind of see it on the other side as well. This is really cool because this is a wear spot from the sling swivel itself. See how it protrudes this part right here? It's actually, when these are tight, you know, it won't slide around this easily. It'll actually be, when the screw is really tight, it'll be really tightened up against the magazine body. So when it goes back and forth like this, when, you know, it's strung across your back and you're marching across Eurasia somewhere, it's slowly wearing down the magazine body here. And that's what we can see here on this magazine. So this is a really good indication, in fact, almost certain, that this magazine had a sling swivel. And we already know this because it's a Châtellerault. But let's say it wasn't. This, I can see this and say, well, if this magazine was produced before 1928, we know for sure that this had a sling swivel. So it's really common to see this on things like Finnish Mosins because Finland used all sorts of old parts mixed and matched. They just used whatever they had, whatever they could get. So If you have a Mosin Nagant, especially a Finnish Mosin Nagant, it could be anything from a 9130 to an M27, an M28, an M24, an M39, it doesn't matter. Make sure to check your magazine to see if you can feel this wear spot here. If you can feel that or see that, that means that this magazine used to have a sling swivel a long time ago in one of its previous lives. Now, for all of our Star Wars fans out there, you'll be familiar with the quote, "Only a Sith deals in absolutes." Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I'm actually not going to say 100% that just because you have this maker's mark from after 1928, that your magazine didn't have a sling swivel. Now, you might say right there, well, Big Sam, you're contradicting yourself because you've already stated that magazines produced after 1910 didn't have these. And that's true, but notice what I said here. I didn't say the magazine was produced after 1928. I said the mark was from after 1928. It's theoretically possible, especially during the early stages of the war, of World War II, in 1941 and 1942, that Russia actually recycled old magazines and potentially restamped them. We don't know for sure. We know that they used old ones, but it's also possible that they restamped old ones with newer markings. So even if you have a magazine with newer markings, be sure to just double check right here to see if you feel anything or see any kind of wear spot right here on the magazine. Because if you do, again, that's almost certain that it had a sling swivel at some point. And if you have a magazine like that, definitely post a comment or send me an email, because that's something that I've just never seen before and something that would be truly fascinating if it actually did exist. Again, these rifles have such a rich history, and we're actually still learning more about these rifles every day. And that's why I like to have y'all watch these videos, because you can help me out by checking these types of things on your Mosin to help us learn more about what types of things they went through and where they came from, things like that. Again, we learn more about these guns every day thanks to people like you who watch these videos and go take a closer look at your Mosin. Because sometimes you'll find something interesting on a Mosin that you just never saw before. So it always pays to take a closer look at it. Well, thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video and maybe you learned something. We've done a number of videos on these magazines with these sling swivels, so be sure to watch them if you haven't already. We got a lot more cool stuff coming down the pipeline, so stay tuned for that if you're interested in more Mosin Nagant content. Thank you guys for watching. Let me know if y'all have any prayer requests, and I'll see you next time.